Imagine you are traveling alone. It is 1825. The roads are dark. The mountains are wild. The wind is brutal. The cold is bone deep. There is one inn on this road, just one. You have no choice but to stop. You knock on the door. A man opens it. He smiles. He offers you food, a bed, warmth. You never leave. This is the story of the Red Inn of Peyrebeille, France's most terrifying murder house, and one of the darkest criminal mysteries of the 19th century. Welcome to Verdict, the Ardèche region of southern France, rocky, remote, breathtaking, and in the early 19th century, completely isolated. At 1,260 meters above sea level, on the national road between Auberge and the Puy-en-Velay, sat a small stone building, the Inn of Peyrebeille. For travelers crossing this wild plateau, it was the only shelter for miles. Merchants, traders, pilgrims, soldiers, anyone making the journey had to stop there. There was no alternative. The inn was run by Pierre and Marie Martin.
End of this road lies an abandoned house with really dark history. I'm going to tell you about it as we walk all the way down here. Let's get onto the history really quick as we get through this. We are walking right now to a abandoned murder house. A 77-year-old woman lived in this house, and in 2012 she was murdered by a homeless man that was 33 years old. And what's sad and crazy, it was done by their own family members. And how awful that is. As far as I know, there is still police tape on the house right now, but again, we have to walk to it, and we don't want to be seen here. Yes, it is very well abandoned, and the people that do own it, because they were pretty wealthy, they're still forgot about the house and they're leaving it to rest. They don't even want to be remembering anything to do with that place right now. We're now making our way through the woods, through the forest, to get to the abandoned house.
Former poor farmers who had, over time, built themselves a comfortable life. By the 1820s, they had accumulated a fortune of 30,000 gold francs, worth approximately 600,000 euros today. For former peasants in rural France, that was extraordinary wealth. Their neighbors noticed, and their neighbors wondered, how had the Martins become so rich in a small inn on a lonely mountain road? The answer, when it finally came, would horrify an entire nation. For years, rumors circulated in the villages around Peyrebeille. Travelers would stop at the inn, they would eat, they would sleep, and some of them never arrived at their destination. Locals whispered about the Martins, about the strange sounds at night, about the smoke that sometimes rose from the chimney in the early hours of the morning, about the wagons that left the inn before dawn, heading toward the river. The rumors grew darker over the years. People said that guests were served their meals, and then never woke up, that travelers were robbed, killed, and their bodies disposed of in ways too terrible to repeat. Some witnesses claimed the Martins had committed up to 50 murders over 26 years, from 1805, when they took over the inn, until 1831.
They were talking about around 50 murders, travelers robbed, killed in atrocious conditions, even cooked, and in the end, the trial will not judge the accused for the other crimes. Some are based only on one testimony. Apparently, they didn't really try to find other testimonies to confirm all this. They also didn't look for material evidence. It's again rumor that explains the arrest of Marie Martin, the woman. Her husband had entrusted her with managing his affairs since his arrest, and it's just inconceivable at that time for her to do that. It was seen as a reversal of values.
The prosecution entered the courtroom, determined to convince the jury that the crimes committed at the Inn of Peyrebeille were neither isolated incidents nor unfortunate misunderstandings. According to the indictment, the defendants were responsible for 2 confirmed murders, 4 attempted murders, and a series of violent robberies carried out between 1808 and 1831. Prosecutors argued that these crimes were not random acts of violence, but part of a long-running pattern that had turned a lonely mountain inn into one of the most feared places in France. Yet, from the very beginning, it became clear that the trial was about far more than the charges listed on paper. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Journalists crowded every available seat. Curious citizens traveled long distances simply to witness what newspapers had already begun calling the trial of the century. Outside the courthouse, conversations about the case dominated streets, taverns, and marketplaces. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about the Martins and the terrifying stories that had surrounded their inn for decades. Inside the courtroom, witness after witness took the stand. Some described travelers who had entered the inn and were never seen again. Others spoke of suspicious activity during the night, wagons leaving before dawn, strange sounds echoing through the isolated mountain property, and unexplained smoke rising from the chimney at unusual hours. Several witnesses repeated long circulating local rumors, claiming that guests had disappeared after spending a single night at the inn. As the testimonies continued, the atmosphere became increasingly dramatic. Witnesses described scenes of shocking violence, hidden crimes, and unimaginable cruelty. Some accounts suggested that unsuspecting travelers had been murdered while they slept. Others claimed victims had been robbed before their bodies were secretly disposed of in the surrounding countryside. The courtroom listened as story after story painted the Martins as ruthless killers operating in one of the most isolated regions of France. But not every testimony carried the same weight. Some statements appeared consistent and believable, supported by details that investigators considered credible. Others relied almost entirely on hearsay, village gossip, or stories that had grown more frightening each time they were retold. A number of witnesses admitted they had never personally seen any murders, but had merely heard rumors from neighbors or travelers. A few of the most sensational allegations could not be verified at all. Among the most disturbing claims were stories of cannibalism and bodies being secretly destroyed. These accounts horrified the public and were eagerly repeated by newspapers across France. Yet, investigators possessed little physical evidence capable of proving such extraordinary accusations. This created an unusual situation. The trial slowly transformed from a straightforward criminal proceeding into something much larger, a struggle between evidence, legend, public opinion, and fear. The defense seized upon exactly that point. Lawyers representing Pierre Martin, Marie Martin, and the other defendants argued that their clients had become victims of circumstances far beyond their control. They insisted that decades of rumors had poisoned public opinion long before the trial even began. According to the defense, people wanted monsters, and once the legend of the Red Inn had spread throughout the region, every unexplained disappearance became another accusation against the Martins. The defense also argued that jealousy played an important role. Pierre and Marie Martin had started life as poor farmers before transforming their isolated inn into a profitable business. By the 1820s, they possessed wealth that many people in the surrounding villages could scarcely imagine. Their prosperity attracted envy. In poor rural communities, sudden financial success often generated suspicion, especially when few people understood how that success had been achieved. Political tensions further complicated the case. Pierre Martin was known to support the royalist cause during a period when France remained deeply divided after years of revolution, empire, and restoration. Political loyalties frequently shaped friendships, business relationships, and legal disputes. According to the defense, Martin had accumulated influential enemies who viewed his downfall as both desirable and convenient. Whether that argument was entirely true remains uncertain. However, historians acknowledge that political divisions during this period were intense, and personal rivalries often influenced the local justice. The defense highlighted another troubling fact. Much of the prosecution's case depended on testimony from individuals who held personal grievances against the Martins. Some had previous disputes with the family. Others were neighbors involved in long-running disagreements. Several witnesses stood to benefit from the Martins' conviction in one way or another. Even more surprisingly, important court documents would later disappear entirely. The disappearance of official records has complicated historical research ever since. Without complete documentation, historians have struggled to reconstruct every detail of the investigation and trial. Missing evidence has left significant gaps in the historical record, ensuring that questions surrounding the case continue nearly 2 centuries later. As the proceedings unfolded, one central question dominated every discussion. Were Pierre and Marie Martin truly responsible for years of murder and robbery? Or had they become victims of one of France's greatest miscarriages of justice? The jury ultimately had to answer that question. Their deliberations, however, were surprisingly brief. After reviewing the evidence and hearing weeks of testimony, the jurors reached their decision without prolonged debate. On June 25, 1833, the verdict was announced before a silent courtroom. Pierre Martin was found guilty and sentenced to death. Marie Martin was also found guilty and sentenced to death. Jean Rochette, the Martin's servant, received the same sentence. Only André Martin escaped execution. He was acquitted and released. For supporters of the prosecution, justice had finally been served. For supporters of the defense, the verdict represented a terrible mistake, driven more by fear than certainty. Throughout the investigation, trial, and sentencing, Pierre and Marie Martin consistently maintained their innocence. Neither confessed, neither admitted responsibility for the murders. Even as execution approached, they refused to change their story. Their legal appeals were unsuccessful. The convictions were upheld. Their final request for royal clemency was submitted to King Louis Philippe. The request was denied. With no further legal options available, preparations began for the executions. Rather than carrying out the sentences quietly in a distant city, authorities made a remarkable decision. The condemned prisoners would be transported back to Peyrebeille itself. The very location where the alleged crimes had occurred would become the site of their public execution. On October 2, 1833, the prisoners were escorted from Privas under heavy guard. As the convoy traveled through villages and across mountain roads, crowds formed along the route. Some people came hoping to witness justice. Others wanted revenge. Many were simply fascinated by the infamous case that had dominated newspapers for months. By the time the procession reached the inn of Peyrebeille, an estimated 30,000 spectators had gathered around the execution site and the surrounding hillsides. For such a remote location, the turnout was extraordinary. At noon, as the bells of nearby La Villate rang the Angelus, preparations were complete. The guillotine stood ready. Marie Martin was led forward first. Moments later, she was executed. Her husband Pierre followed. Then came Jean Rochette. Some believed Rochette had been little more than a servant manipulated by his employers. Others believed he had willingly participated in every crime. His exact role remained uncertain, even at the moment of his death. As he approached the guillotine, Rochette shouted words that would become one of the greatest mysteries of the entire affair. "Cursed masters, what have you not made me do?" The statement stunned the crowd. People immediately began debating its meaning. Was Rochette confessing to crimes he had committed? Was he accusing Pierre and Marie Martin of forcing him to participate? Or was he simply speaking in fear and desperation as death approached? No one could answer with certainty. Those final words have remained the subject of historical debate ever since. Following the executions, the bodies were buried in the cemetery at Lanars. But the story did not end there. That very night, unknown individuals secretly opened the graves. The heads of the executed prisoners were removed. They were taken for scientific examination during a period when phrenology, the belief that personality and criminal tendencies could be determined by the shape of the skull, was considered a legitimate field of study. Plaster casts were made from the skulls. Remarkably, those casts still survive today and are preserved at the Crossroads Museum in Le Puy-en-Velay, serving as unusual reminders of both the case itself and the questionable scientific theories of the 19th century. The Inn of Peyrebeille also survives. Today it operates as a museum, welcoming visitors interested in one of France's most famous criminal legends. Guests can still see the original stone building, the great fireplace, historic furnishings, and rooms where countless travelers once spent the night. Nearby stands a stone cross marking the place where the executions occurred, commemorating the day thousands gathered to witness the final chapter of the Red Inn affair. Yet, despite nearly 2 centuries of debate, the central mystery remains unresolved. Were Pierre and Marie Martin truly responsible for dozens of murders? Did they kill 50 travelers over 26 years? Were only a handful of crimes committed? Or were they innocent people destroyed by rumors, politics, and public hysteria? Historians remain divided. Some argue that the evidence presented at trial was deeply flawed and insufficient to justify the death sentences. They believe unreliable witnesses, missing records, political hostility, and sensational journalism combined to produce a miscarriage of justice. Others point to the Martins' unexplained wealth, suspicious circumstances surrounding missing travelers, and the testimony presented during the investigation as evidence that the convictions were justified. Because so much evidence has been lost, the complete truth may never be known. In many ways, the mystery died alongside Pierre Martin, Marie Martin, and Jean Rochette beneath the blade of the guillotine. The questions they left behind continue to echo through history. Even decades later, the legend remained profitable. In 1893, 60 years after the executions, a newspaper reported that the famous inn was being offered for sale for only 100 francs. The article noted with irony that the property itself was worth far less than the books, newspaper stories, and sensational accounts that had been written about it. Some places become inseparable from the stories attached to them. Some crimes continue haunting generations long after every witness has disappeared. The Inn of Peyrebeille became both a historical landmark and a symbol of one of France's greatest unsolved mysteries. Whether it was truly a house of serial murder or the center of one of history's greatest judicial controversies remains a question that historians continue to debate today. That was the Red Inn affair. This was Verdict. Subscribe for new cases every week. Every case has a story. Every story has a verdict.